Recently, I watched Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, and that got me thinking, how is it different from Disney's Pinocchio? And that got me thinking, how are they both different from the book? Hi, I'm Amanda at Spineless Books, your one-stop shop for all things audiobook. So today we're going to be talking about Pinocchio. All three versions, Disney, Guillermo del Toro, and the book, the original book. So let's talk timelines first. So Guillermo del Toro's version is the most recent. It was released in 2022. It's a stop-motion animated film. It's on Netflix. If you haven't checked it out, you definitely should. Then Disney released, in next most recent history, Disney released the classic animated Pinocchio in 1940. So when was the book written? The book was actually written by Carlo Collodi in 1883. And here's the tricky thing. It really wasn't a book. It was actually a serial published for a weekly children's magazine. So that helps explain some of the disjointed nature of the story of Pinocchio, particularly in the book, because it's actually small vignettes that were meant to go week to week, but not to thread together as an overarching story. So keep that in mind as we talk about the two movies, because there are hints of that structure in those movies. Let's talk about Pinocchio's origin story in each of the versions, because they're very different between the three. So in Pinocchio, the Disney movie, when we begin the movie, we start with Jiminy Cricket. If you remember, he's singing When You Wish Upon a Star. And he is basically looking for a place to stay for the night because it's raining. And as he is looking around, he finds his way into the cabin of Geppetto. Now, when Geppetto first comes down the stairs and Jiminy Cricket's been dancing around and singing, he doesn't really do anything other than note that he's finishing up this puppet. So Pinocchio already exists when the movie begins. Geppetto paints a little smile on his face and he gives him some eyebrows, and that's it. Other than that, he's been carved, he's been sitting on a shelf. But Geppetto goes to bed that night and he says to Figaro, his cat, "Wouldn't it be amazing? I wish he was a real boy." Enter the Blue Fairy. She animates Pinocchio. She appoints Jiminy Cricket to be his conscience. And then she says, basically, make him good. And she goes off. Now, in the Guillermo del Toro version, it's very, very different. Geppetto, this version, by the way, is set in the interwar years between World War I and World War II. So Geppetto is a woodworker, and he, makes all kinds of fancy wood things. And he has a son named Carlo, who I wonder where we got that name, Guillermo del Toro. Could it be from Carlo Collodi, perhaps, the author? So he has a son, and Carlo, unfortunately, this is a little bit of a spoiler, just a teeny one, but Carlo dies when a bomb hits their town. And Geppetto just can't get over it. He goes through fits of drunkenness. He's just grieving all the time. He's really, truly beside himself, and he's incredibly unhappy. And one night, in a drunken rage, he carves Pinocchio. So Pinocchio is something that Geppetto makes in order to help with something that he's lacking, as opposed to in the Disney movie where he's really just kind of chilling and makes a puppet. Now, in the book, it's different than all of that. What happens in the book is that Geppetto is a wood carver and he wants to make a puppet because he wants to travel and use this puppet to entertain people. So his intention is a puppet. So he goes to a guy named Mastro Cherry. Now, Mastro Cherry appears only in this first little vignette in the book. But basically, Mastro Cherry has been dealing with an enchanted piece of wood. It's a stick, as it's described, that is talking back and basically sassing him. And when Geppetto comes to Mastro Cherry and says, "I'd like a piece of wood to make a puppet," he kind of gives him this piece of wood as a way of offloading the problem stick. And that's what Pinocchio is carved from. So even as Geppetto is carving him in the book, he's kind of pulling pranks on him and being a little bit mischievous. So three really very different ways of starting a story, all with a puppet. Disney just skips right over it and it's like, hey, here's the puppet. He was here. Tee. And Guillermo del Toro makes him out of strife in the story, but really he just was motivated in the book, Geppetto, to make a puppet, and then this piece of wood happened to be enchanted. So very different, but they all kind of get us to the same place. So what about our characters? Now, obviously, Pinocchio and Geppetto are common to all three versions. But what about the cricket? So Jiminy Cricket, as we know him in the classic Disney film, is pretty much a sidekick to Pinocchio through the whole thing. In Guillermo del Toro's version, it's not Jiminy Cricket, it's Sebastian J. Cricket, aspiring writer. Now, he's actually reluctantly involved in this version of the story. The cricket was looking for a home, he happened to go into a tree, then Geppetto happened to cut the tree down and happened to make a puppet, and it happened to land that where he lives is right in Pinocchio's heart. But Sebastian J. Cricket doesn't really want to be involved. However, when the Blue Fairy, who is common to all three versions, shows up, she basically bribes him and says, like, hey, make him good and I'll give you whatever you want. So he agrees, but he's not in it for anyone other than himself, as opposed to Jiminy Cricket, who like really wants to be good and be recognized. And so he takes this conscience role on very readily. Now, in the book, there is a cricket. But that cricket is not really a big presence. He's there towards the beginning of the vignettes, kind of has an unfortunate situation happen to him, and then he resurfaces a little bit at the end, but he's a pretty minor character in the books. Now, as far as other characters are concerned, there are some commonalities between all three. So Lampwick, who is the best friend, if you recall, from the Disney movie. He's the kid that takes Pinocchio to Pleasure Island, it's called. It's different in the book. It's the land of toys in the book. So Lampwick is the character that takes Pinocchio and they turn into donkeys, which isn't great. He is also Lampwick in the book. But in Guillermo del Toro's version, he's Candlewick. So clearly a nod to the other two versions, but not necessarily a brand new concept. The fox and the cat are also common characters between all three stories, kind of. There is a fox in each one. The fox and the cat dupe Pinocchio in the book version. They're sort of like weird little narrators that move the story around in the Disney version, and they're also not having his best interests in mind. In the Guillermo del Toro version, the fox is really a man named Volpe, which, hint, is the Italian word for fox. But he doesn't have a cat with him. He has a monkey. So we kind of trade the cat for the monkey, Spazzatura. There's also a character in the Disney version of the story named Stromboli, and Stromboli is kind of the carnival master. Now, a little fun fact if you've seen the Guillermo del Toro version, there is a character very briefly in the scene at the carnival who's a weightlifter, and he's a really big build and he's got a big bushy beard. He looks a lot like Stromboli from the Disney movie, and I learned when I watched the documentary after the Netflix movie that actually that was supposed to be Volpe. He was supposed to be the fox, but in a stop motion animation, he had way too many moving parts, so they made him a minor character instead because the maquette just wasn't working for all of the scenes that he would have had to be in. And Volpe's in a lot of scenes in the Guillermo del Toro version, like a lot. The last common character between all three is the whale, who's a shark in the book and a dogfish in the Guillermo del Toro version. But that vignette is pulled directly from the book of Geppetto living inside of the whale and Pinocchio getting swallowed by the whale, sometimes in some versions on purpose and other times totally by accident. But he does enter a large aquatic animal in all three stories. So what about the plot points? In the Disney version, we see several exact things from the book. We see the fox and the cat duping Pinocchio. We see Pinocchio and Geppetto being swallowed by the fish or the whale. We see the carnival master capturing Pinocchio and, basically trying to get away with stuff. Lampwick in the Disney movie is a cigar-smoking, pool-playing, probably 10-year-old. So it's a little weird, but the donkey thing comes direct from the book. The idea that they go off to this place where they don't have to do any work and they don't have to do, there's no money to spend, they just do whatever they want. That does come directly from the book. That is one of the vignettes. The fox and the cat are a small vignette that actually repeats a couple of times, so they make a natural narrator character in the Disney movie. But in general, the Blue Fairy coming to help him and ask Pinocchio to be good, and then deciding, yay, you've become good, is the general story of all of the cereal. Del Toro treats a lot of things differently in his version of the story. So we see nods from both the book and the Disney version. So for example, the cricket's really not prominent in the book, but he's very prominent in the Disney version, and Del Toro maintains the prominence of the cricket in his version. We have Lampwick in the book and Lampwick in the Disney story, and he makes him Candlewick in his version. Now, Candlewick is the son of the Italian podesta or governor, and he is Pinocchio's best friend. That's in common, but Lampwick is kind of a jerk in the Pinocchio that Disney produced. But Candlewick is actually a really sort of great guy. Few little scenes that are in common, like for example, Pinocchio's feet catching fire happens in the book and in the movie. And he agrees to go to school in both the Del Toro version and the book when his father gives him new feet after they've burned off in the fire. But a couple of other differences. For example, we have Stromboli in the Disney version and we have Volpe as the villain in the Del Toro version. We have the Blue Fairy in both, although in the Del Toro version, the Blue Fairy sort of has like a weird sister person who's in charge of death. Del Toro has added an immortality process to the entire story, and so you kind of need somebody to manage that, so it makes sense that she's a relative of the Blue Fairy. Related to the death idea, there's actually an interesting bit that Del Toro pulls directly from the book, and it's a very tiny piece in the book. In fact, I would say it's maybe 2 sentences of the book, but there is a scene, one of the vignettes, where Pinocchio is needing to take medicine because he's sick and the Blue Fairy can't get him to take the medicine. So basically she says, all right, well, if you're not going to take it, you're going to end up dying. It's a little morbid in 1883. But she brings this brigade of black rabbits with a coffin to pick Pinocchio up. And he asks why they're there. And she says, well, you're going to die if you don't take the medicine. So he takes it. The black rabbits with the coffins go away, but they do make an appearance in the Del Toro version. And I was very curious because they're really random in that part of the story. But that's one of the things that made me wonder, what was the book really like? And here it is. That's the exact roots of what Del Toro put in his movie. So a lot of interesting things that go between all of them, but it's very obvious that he was influenced by the book and the Disney film as he directed his stop motion animation. By the way, is that possibly the best version because it's a stop motion animation about puppets made with puppets? So who did it best? I'm going to have to give it to Del Toro in this case. The book is a whole bunch of very tiny, really weird morality examples, almost like Aesop's fables. They don't really all go together as one coherent thing from beginning to end. And then Disney takes that and they really simplify it. They give you like 3 large vignettes, and the message of the story, which is the message of one vignette in the book, is not to lie. But Del Toro takes this entire concept and he makes it a much bigger, much more massive idea. And he really begins to examine the relationship between what we value and our actions. And the way that Pinocchio's actions change throughout the movie as his values change is really impressive. And he basically begins to value the people in his life, and all of his actions after those moments are dictated in order to support those people. And so that whole idea of the Blue Fairy asking him to become a good boy, to be real, he kind of in the book, it's like, oh, hey, I gave my money to the Blue Fairy, now I'm real. In the Disney movie, it's like, oh, hey, I've kind of been a jerk, and now one time I did something nice. I carried Geppetto out on my back from a whale. Like, okay, now I'm a real boy. Del Toro makes him earn it. He does a lot of things throughout the movie. He becomes an upstander. He fights back against evil. He really reaches out and helps people. He helps people develop courage. And Pinocchio in Del Toro's version really proves himself on multiple occasions. So in my opinion, it's a much better story. It has a lot more of an arc. And I think Del Toro really nailed it. Have you seen all 3, or read one, or seen 2, or watched one, or curious about one and not the other? Let me know what you think. Because remember, you might love what I hate and hate what I love. So make your own opinion. But thanks for listening to mine. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I hope to hear your thoughts.